Okay, thank you. Okay, greetings, Dobry den. This is the rise and fall of complex societies with the School of Advanced Studies at the University of UTMN. This is our open course so that there will be people viewing through streaming on YouTube. Today, we are extremely honored to have a guest speaker, Dr. Eric Cline, one of the foremost leaders in the study of the collapse of the late Bronze Age, one of the most important periods in the history of Western civilization. Dr. Cline is the former chair of the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the current director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute at the George Washington University. He is a National Geographic Explorer, National Endowment for Humanities Public Scholar, a Fulbright Scholar with degrees from Dartmouth, Yale, and University of Pennsylvania. He's an active field archaeologist with more than 30 seasons of work in countries including Israel, Egypt, Crete, Cyprus, as well as the United States. And he's the author of over 20 books. And his book, 1177, is going to be the focus of tonight's discussion. So without further distraction, let me introduce Dr. Eric Cline, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to see you and to see everyone else, even if it's only virtually. But since this is a topic near and dear to my heart, I'm always happy to talk about it. So just let me know how we want to format this discussion, and I'm at your disposal.
Everyone should have some questions already ready for you, and everyone's viewed your online lecture, so they're familiar with the topic, and I see that some of them have also gone through your book. So I'm thinking that we could just go ahead and open up to questions about the period.
Yeah, that'd be fine by me. And what I would also encourage is if someone asks a question and I at least begin to answer it, that perhaps we can open it up to others to join in and make it a discussion rather than just me answering a question. I'd be quite happy with that because surely others have opinions too.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and open it up to the students and anyone who happens to be online who wants to go ahead and send a question through the chat, and then that will be relayed to us through the Zoom chat. So you can send it over to Shaklo, who's assisting us, and she'll transfer it over to us. So let's go ahead and open up to the floor for the class students here. And I see a hand up from Artyom.
Yeah, sure. Hello, Eric. Thank you for coming. And well, I heard your field of studies also connected with the biblical plot of Exodus. And well, there is this great narrative of great plagues of Egypt in the book of Exodus. And so how much of this narrative can we trust? How much of evidence for it are there? And if it was real, at least partially, like how could Egypt be recovered after such an environmental and political kind of destruction?
Excellent question. Excellent question, and one that we wrestle with all the time. So you've got on the one hand, you've got the biblical account, which is, its own field of study, with people arguing that you can trust it completely and others arguing you can't trust it at all. And many people like myself in the middle saying, well, if you can corroborate it with extra biblical, external stuff, then you can start to maybe consider it, shall we say. So in terms of the plagues, this falls into the category that for me would be trust but verify, as the Romans would say. It certainly sounds plausible in terms of context, let's put it that way. And by plagues of Egypt and all that, I'm presuming you're referring to the ones like when Moses is leaving, and we're talking about the Exodus at that time. So the one that I just mentioned, I should tell you too that I just finished revising 1177. In fact, it went to the copy editor yesterday. It should be out next January. And one of the things that I did was to add in a little section on disease and whether a pandemic was part of it. You might notice I'm trying to make it relevant to today for some reason. So in that little section on disease, I added in the question of the killing of the firstborn, right? When the 10 plagues came over and the firstborn are killed. I said, can we consider this or not? If we can, then we could talk about plague as being one of the stressors for the collapse as well. Otherwise, we don't have any evidence for it. We have some evidence for disease in terms of Shuppi-Lulliuma, one of my favorite people in ancient history, the king of the Hittites. We know he died of an epidemic. It may well have been the Black Death. But that's back in 1350 BC, 150 years before the collapse. The killing of the firstborn, I would say if the Exodus takes place, and I'm one of the people that says it's a big if, because we don't have any archaeological evidence for it whatsoever. It may well have happened, but we can't find it, which is a problem for me as an archaeologist. And then you've got the problem of when do you date it? Because if you go with the biblical dating, Exodus should have happened at about 1450 BC, which is the time of Tutmosis III. I don't think there's any way it would have happened. Archaeologically, it makes more sense for the Exodus to happen in about 1250 BC, which would then be part of the collapse. So you've got that problem too. So when you ask a question about the plagues of Egypt, it's such an open-ended, broad question that on the one hand, we could talk about that for the rest of today's session. On the other hand, we will never come to a conclusion because we just don't have enough evidence. So, and I put the biblical account in, as I said, in the category of things where it's a nice story. It might be true, or parts of it might be true, or none of it might be true. But until we get, especially to the first millennium, where we have inscriptions from the Neo-Assyrians and everybody that are mentioning the kings of Israel, there we can corroborate it. And there I'm, feel like we're on much firmer ground. Second millennium, patriarchs, Moses, all that, open-ended question, open-ended. But that's what makes this so fascinating, right? There's no easy answers, and therefore I think it's fun to study. That's why it's fascinating. But so excellent question. I don't have an answer for you.
Yeah, great. I guess I can also narrow it down a bit then. Well, if there is no archaeological evidence, may there be any kind of geological evidence on the soil and stuff? Because part of these plagues of Egypt was insects, like swarms and stuff, which probably could have influenced the soil and the fertility of it. Probably.
No, the problem is we've got no evidence whatsoever. There's nothing for any of it, despite all the documentaries on TV and despite everything on YouTube. And this is actually something else I work on. I've got a book called From Eden to Exile, Unraveling Mysteries of the Bible. And the Exodus is one entire chapter of it. I would caution, there are a lot of people out there making claims. Some people are in it for the money. Some people are in it for fame and fortune, Be aware, I would say, a hefty dose of skepticism. But no, we don't have any evidence for insects or anything like that. I wouldn't be at all surprised, drought and famine, that seems to fit. And in fact, we do have now climatic evidence from Egypt. I was just doing more research on that. And there will be a longer section in the revised edition of 1177. It looks like there's a drop in the level of the Nile at that time. It looks like, if I remember correctly, there's less rain up in the highlands from where the Nile comes. And so, contrary a bit to what I wrote in 1177, Egypt is more affected than I had thought it had been. And then, of course, you've got, I think it's Ramses V, his mummy shows evidence of smallpox. Whether or not he died of that, I don't know. But so there's much more evidence coming out, lots of studies since about 2010 in terms of the levels of the Nile. So I would go, I'm happy with drought and famine. I'm good with that. Insects, not so much, but it would also be hard to find that in the archaeological record.
Okay. How about the stela with the reference to the seed of Israel is no more from Mermtah?
Yeah. Okay. So I give it a date of 1207. This is the inscription from Pharaoh Merneptah or Mermtah, and it's mostly on one side concerned with the Sea Peoples and the Libyans, and on the other, it mentions this: Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. So, from my point of view, the importance, as everybody says, is that it's the first time Israel is mentioned outside the Bible. So we know that something known as Israel existed by the year 1207. Though a better way to put it would be, what is that, the 5th year of Neremtah? And of course, the dates for the pharaohs go up and down depending on which Egyptologist you talk to. But anyway, I like 1207. And the importance for me as well is that the determinative, if I'm not mistaken, the little sign at the beginning of the word indicates it's a people rather than a place. Yeah. So even though the context shows it's somewhere up in Canaan, it shows it's actually a group of people known as Israel. So this dovetails then into kind of our last question about the Exodus, is right. When did they move on up there? And I have kind of an unorthodox theory that between us doesn't really work, but never mind. And I mentioned that in the book. And that is my question very simply, is how could the Israelites have overthrown the Canaanites and established themselves when the Canaanites were so powerful, like at Hatzor and Lachish and everything else? And one thing that I suggest is that those big Canaanite cities had already collapsed, either at the hands of the Sea Peoples or internal rebellion or drought and famine. And the Israelites simply come in, whether they're moving up from Egypt or whether they're just coming down from the highlands of Canaan, where they had already been, like Israel Finkelstein thinks. But they come down into what were at that point smoking ruins of the cities. And in the biblical account, they claim, hey, we captured Hatzor, we captured Jericho, we captured Lachish. And in actuality, they didn't capture them at all. They simply moved on in after they were destroyed. So I call this the coattails hypothesis, because they came in on the coattails of the Sea Peoples and the collapse, and that they basically claimed for themselves what they actually didn't do. But for me, that explains why the Israelites are able to come in and establish what will become the kingdom of David and Solomon. But you can see just how hypothetical it is. And the main problem I've got is that if the Mermtah stele mentions them up there in 1207, and if the biblical account of 40 years of wandering is correct, and 40, of course, is a sacred number, so I inherently distrust that also, it's more likely symbolic just for a generation. So they're wandering for a generation. Well, that means that they've moved out in 1250 BC from Egypt. That's just before everything's already started to collapse. So if my coattails hypothesis is right, I would have wanted them to do it almost 100 years later, like 1177. You told me that's when they're moving around. I'm like, good, everybody's collapsing, or even 1130. So for me, I like the idea of them moving out on the coattails, but the timing doesn't quite work. So I've got to manipulate that a bit. If anybody's got ideas, I'd love to hear them. But anyway, so that's a very important inscription.
The archaeology of Jericho, that does kind of support what you're saying, doesn't it? As I recall, it was already destroyed before the Israelites.
It does, yes, it does and it doesn't. It's already destroyed. The part of the problem is it's actually destroyed earlier than we want it to be.
Yeah,
so,
right.
and some of the new archaeology is changing things. It was kind of gospel for a couple of decades that Jericho wasn't even inhabited in the late Bronze Age. But there's a new set of excavations that have been started there. Lorenzo Negro are there, the Italians, with the local archaeologist. And he is now, he says that he's finding evidence that it was in fact inhabited in the late Bronze Age, at least partially, and that Kathleen Kenyon was just digging in the wrong part of the mound, as it were. In which case, maybe it does work at Jericho after all. So, but this is the beauty of archaeology. Things could change tomorrow, depending on what somebody finds today. So, yeah.
All right. Back out to the class. See some hands come up here. You guys all have questions. I know that.
Yeah, and they're good questions. I took a sneak peek at some of them. So feel free to ask them. They're all great questions.
Okay, yeah. Gregory.
Right. So my question is that how does the relations, it's not really connected with the previous discussion, but how does the relations between civilizations which fell affected future development of this civilization? I mean, is there a correlation between former relations and future ones, including trade or military aggression, cultural exchange too?
So let me see if I understand this correctly. They're falling at the end of the late Bronze Age, and you're asking how that then affects them after the fall, like in kind of bouncing back. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Excellent question. I'm actually working on exactly that. So at the moment, I'm working on a sequel, 1177, at the same time as updating it. My editor at Princeton said, well, what happened after the collapse? And I said, well, like I do, there was a dark age. And he's like, yeah, but they eventually came back, didn't they? And I said, yeah, sure. So he said, why don't you write about that? So the sequel is going to be the next 400 years. And the title might not be surprising. The title for the book is going to be After 1177, which kind of makes sense. So I've been investigating what I would say. The short answer to your question is looking at this in terms of resilience. How do they bounce back? Do they have to rebuild totally? Is there a little bit left? And so I would begin answering your question by saying each of the civilizations, each of the societies that was affected by the collapse of the late Bronze Age responded differently. They responded differently in terms of time. They responded differently in terms of how they actually did it. The international relations were extremely important. Most of them had broken. When the collapse happened, most of the international trade routes, as far as I can tell, were severed. That we don't have direct evidence for that. We can only study it by proxy, indirect. But the fact that they're not making bronze like they used to indicates to me that the trade route over to Afghanistan, for example, must have been cut, so they can't get tin anymore. We know that Cyprus is affected, and therefore they're not getting the copper from Cyprus anymore. So what they have to do, first and foremost, is to reestablish the trade routes. And once they do that, I think that is what sets them all back on the road to recovery, if we want to put it that way. So this is where some of the new civilizations, and I use new in quotes, like the Phoenicians come into being important. The Phoenicians, a lot of people think that they're part of the collapse. They're actually not. They are around. They're on the coast of the Levant, the coast of Canaan. But in the late Bronze Age, we would have a different name for them. They're the Canaanites. In the aftermath of the collapse, those Canaanites that are on the coast of what is today mostly Lebanon, but also up into Syria and down into modern-day northern Israel, they become the Phoenicians, and they're the ones that start back on the maritime trade routes. In fact, I've never checked this for sure, but I've long been told that if you translate the word Canaan and you translate the word Phoenician, they both mean purple. So they've got a variety of meanings, but one of them is purple for both of them. So I see the Phoenicians as the survivors of the Canaanites, in which case you've got some continuity, and I'm going to explore that in the sequel to the book. But for our purposes, what's important is that the Phoenicians take off in their boats probably as early as the 11th century. So, within a couple of decades, a century at most, and they sail not only to North Africa, of course, but to Greece and to Italy and over into Spain. And they bring with them not only purple dye, which is what they're famous for, but they bring the alphabet. And so the alphabet in both Greece and in Italy actually stems from the Phoenician alphabet. And that's where many of our alphabets today come from. I mean, here in the United States, we're still using what's known as the Latin alphabet, which came out of Italy. But that Latin alphabet came from the Phoenician alphabet. Same thing with the Greek alphabet, right? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. So with writing, from my point of view, I think writing is essential to any civilization. And it's the Phoenicians that bring writing back to Greece after they had completely lost it, right? The Mycenaeans, the Minoans, they're writing in Linear A and Linear B. And we know Linear B is an early form of Greek. But that ends, say, by 1100 or earlier. There's no more Linear B in Greece, so they have forgotten how to write, if you want to put it that way. And I'm not at all surprised, because remember, at that time, maybe only the top 1% knew how to read and write. And I would even not characterize it as top, because the kings and the queens, most of them, we don't think they could read or write, because the text, the scribes, it says, say to the king. So if you're saying it to the king, it probably means he can't read and write. But it also means if only 1% were able to read and write and they die off, then you're done for. So I think that writing is imperative to bringing the civilization back. Now, in terms of the Phoenicians, the other ones, like I said, they all vary. The Greeks, they go down for the count for up to 300 years. They're not back until the 8th century BC. But the Assyrians, for example, in what is today modern-day Iraq, the Assyrians come back within 30, 40, 50 years, and then one of their kings at that time, it's as if nothing happened. The Assyrians were, by this point, we're calling them the New Assyrians, the Neo-Assyrians. They've got writing. They never lost it. They've got major palaces. They've still got the king. They've still got all the king's council. Life in Neo-Assyria continued for a while, but then they hit a rocky patch. And round about 1100, they go down for 200 years. So they go down a little bit later than everybody. And I think they hold on for two reasons. One, their system stayed in place with the king and the rules and the writing. But secondly, they were on the Tigris and Euphrates. So I think the drought didn't hurt them as much. I also think that's why Egypt hangs on better than anybody else, because they've got the Nile, even if it does drop. So what you need then to come back, it turns out, is to put everything back into place. Now, it will be very different in the Iron Age. You do reconstruct the international trade routes. You do reconstruct life. But now, apart from the Neo-Assyrians and their big empire, which takes a while to grow, most everybody else is small, little city-states, right? Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah, the kingdoms in Cyprus, which are lots of little city-states. And this is what Colin Renfrew and others have said happens during a systems collapse, is when it comes back, you're at a lower level of socio-cultural complexity. You basically have to start from scratch, from the ground up again. But then eventually, you've got the big empires coming up again. Neo-Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, Persians, Alexander the Great, then the Romans. So, you could see a cycle of empires rising and falling, if you want to put it that way. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But anyway, so to return to your original question, what they eventually all lost on the collapse, they had to rebuild. But it took different people, different lengths of time, and different degrees of success. Hittites never come back. There are little remnants that are left in North Syria, for example, Neo-Hittites, but some of them go away and never come back. Others do manage to reclaw their way up and reestablish. And then we get the Iron Age in the first millennium. So excellent question. Very, very complex series of data for the answer.
Thank you. Sonia, do you want to?
Yes, and my question is connected to Artyom's question. And what kind of difficulties the Bible and Christianity have created for historians? I mean, how huge was impact of altered data, destroyed data, and maybe changed documents and so on?
Well, okay, so that's a couple of different questions all in one big one. Yes, so the impact of the Bible and Christianity on archaeology, I would say pluses and minuses, both good and bad. The good part is it started what we would call biblical archaeology, where we're going off and excavating and trying to find out what happened in those lands back in those times. The problem is, most people think that biblical archaeology is out to either prove or disprove the Bible, right? And in actuality, it's doing neither of those. As a biblical archaeologist, which I do consider myself as one of my hats, I'm not out to prove the Bible, but I'm also not out to disprove it. I'm out to find out what life was like for people in those lands of Mesopotamia and Egypt and what is now Palestine and Israel and Lebanon and Syria and Egypt. You know, what did the people both back in the time, say, of Moses and in the time of Jesus, what was it like for them? What did they eat? What did they wear? What were they scared of? Did they believe in a life after death? You know, what was life like for them? And were they similar to us or were they different? So in some ways, what I do has nothing to do with the Bible. It just happens to be that's the area that I excavate. But the Bible does provide us with a textual source, like we mentioned already. And so I have to tell you, I'm not particularly religious. So I treat it as I do any other text, an Egyptian text, a Neo-Assyrian text, a Hittite text, a Linear B tablet. I know for a lot of people, like much of the world, it attaches religious belief to it. I want to sever that and say, okay, here's your religion and here's the text. Let's separate them. And this is what archaeologists have to do, especially some of the more religious archaeologists. I've got a lot of friends who are Seventh-day Adventists, who are Orthodox Jews, who are evangelical Christians, and they fervently believe in the biblical account, including in what we would call the inerrancy of the words. That is, every word is true. It's the word of God. So I asked them, what do you do with that? What do you do with where the biblical account and what you're finding in archaeology doesn't seem to tie together? And they have said things like, I think one of my favorite quotes is Israel Finkelstein, who I dug with at Megiddo, Armageddon. And he said, look, at Passover, we do all the ceremonies, we do all the rituals, everything. And then 2 days later, I say to my daughters, you know, that probably never happened. And they're like, well, why did you do that 2 nights before? He said, because religion and tradition are different from history and archaeology. He says, I can have that religion and tradition, even if the archaeology doesn't support it, which I thought was an interesting answer. So the Bible and Christianity, I think, have been both good and bad for archaeology. In terms of like falsifying documents, destroying evidence, this and that, I have seen no evidence of that. It may well be that I'm just unaware of it, but I don't think anybody's done anything. I frequently see like conspiracy theories like, oh, the Vatican did this, the Vatican did that. I haven't seen anything like that at all. So from that point of view, that's good. I think we're able to study it undistorted. As to what we've lost in the meantime, like what people might have done in the Middle Ages, I've got no idea. But in terms of modern interference, I think we're okay with that. Yeah. So I hope that answered your question a bit.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Good, good.
Vasily, I think yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my question is...
It's a little weak.
Well, my question is it even if we have some data about this period, well, this collapse was a multi-casual one. And my question, is it possible to define a certain point in time when this collapse had begun? So can we say that that is a tipping point of the collapse?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And you know what? I wish we could. That would be so nice. It would be great to be able to say, yes, there was an earthquake at Mycenae in 1252 BC, and that was the tipping point that pushed it over. We can't, unfortunately. All we can do, and I've been looking at exactly this because I was trying to figure out, when did all this start? Colin Renfrew says it takes like a century, but I'm like, okay, so when did it start? I think the simple answer is we know it's in progress by, gosh, let me be cautious. Certainly by 1225 BCE, it's rolling along, maybe as early as 1250. By 1200 BCE, there's no doubt that it's happening. And I would say on the other side of things, by say 1175, 1150, there's no doubt that they're already falling if they haven't already fallen. So 1250, I would say, is the earliest for it starting. But even that's a guesstimate, right? That's the best we can do. But more interesting, I think, is your question of what's the tipping point. And that for me is really the crux of the question. Because as you've seen in the video and the book and all that, it's not monocausal, it's multicausal, as you said. And for me, the question would be, which of those was the straw that broke the camel's back, as the saying goes? What's the tipping point? What pushed them over? So, you can survive an earthquake, you can survive disease, you can survive an invader. Most of your people will be killed, but some will survive. But at what point, when these calamities are piled on top of each other, at what point does your system start to collapse? And that's actually what I would be interested in knowing what you guys think, because this also impacts something else I've been wondering. What's the order in which these things happened? Some of them, I think, obviously are linear. Like, I don't think you have famine unless you've already had a drought, right? Drought's going to lead to famine. But at what point do your invaders start migrating? Is it because of the drought, or is it because of the famine? Or is it because previous invaders had cut the trade routes? Or is it because your town had an internal rebellion and somebody burnt down your house? So, what order does this happen in? And I don't think we've got an answer for that. And that's why, like in the lecture, I take issue with it's not as linear as people say. It's not A goes to B goes to C. It's you've got A and B, and then you've got C, and then you toss in E, and oh yeah, D happens, and then, oops, guess what? People were collapsing. I don't know if you knew that, but we're collapsing. So, yeah. Now, for a modern parallel, and this is where the article with Nina Fedorov comes in. And I have to tell you, what happened was I was giving a lecture on this, at some society here in DC, and she was in the audience, and she came right up and she said, "You've just described what's happening in Syria today." And I said, "Great, let's write an article about it." And so the two of us collaborated. And what's coming out there, of course, in the civil war in Syria that's going on, there are now indications that it was begun in large part because of the drought that hit Syria from, I think it was about 2006 to 2010, and that drove everybody into the cities. And that started, that was the trigger. The people that studied this said, look, it's not the drought that caused the civil war, but the drought was the stressor that pushed everything over. And I would agree with that. And so I think in terms of the late Bronze Age, it's the same thing. I think the drought and the famine were probably what pushed everybody over. But if you were to tell me, look, an earthquake hit at 1185 and it hit the whole region and that pushed it over, I would have said, okay, good, I'm good with that. Or if you had said, look, the Sea Peoples really did what the Egyptians said, and they're the ones that pushed it over, I'd be like, okay, good, we've solved that. But for now, I don't know the order these things happened in, and I don't know what was the final one where everybody went, okay, bye-bye, and they went down. So you're discussing that type of stuff in this class. It would be interesting to know what you think, but honestly, I don't think there's an answer yet. I don't think our data is sufficiently granular and specific that we could say either it went in this order or yes, this was the final one. I don't think we have enough yet. Now, if we find a text, a written inscription someday, and it says, oh, we had drought, we had famine, and then those pesky sea peoples came, and then we all died, then we might have our answer. But for now, not so much.
Do you look much at the institutional structure within the socio-political systems? I heard a talk from Karakuni the other night, and she was talking about the centralization of authority and power and expansion of the family as the controlling bureaucracy under Ramses II, for instance, and
right.
That, which was fine under Ramses II, but as you carry that on into generations, that it creates this bureaucratic weakness, this inability, this infighting that causes, in Jared Diamond's terms, it makes them less capable of responding to these stressors that are going on.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's something I didn't look at. It's not my specialty for some degree, but I would agree that if you've got something like that, it most likely contributed to it. A stagnant, bloated bureaucracy where everybody's just retired in place and pushing papers all day, they're not going to be nimble and on the uptake in terms of a response. Yeah. So I think that would have affected the bigger empires, Egypt, like Kara said, and the Hittites in particular. The little city-states like Biridia at Megiddo, if he had still been around, they might have been a little bit more nimble because they were smaller. But I also do think one would have to look at how centralized the economy was, like you said. And this is where somebody like Chris Monroe and his book, Scales of Fate, comes in. And Susan Sherratt, who's at Sheffield now, since they're looking at this in terms of the economic aspect, that, yeah, I think that's going to be a part of it. I'm not so sure it's going to be a part in terms of the initial going down the slippery slope, but definitely in terms of how they responded. And this comes to another question I was trying to look at. If you're an Egyptian or if you're a Hittite at that time, do you know that you're collapsing? Do you know there's a problem? Or are you just happily saying, yeah, times are tough right now. Yeah, there's a pandemic going through. Yeah, there's people unemployed, but it's okay. Overall, we get through this. And then, somebody from the future says, dude, no, you're not going to get through it. You're in the middle of a collapse. You just don't know it. So did those big bloated bureaucracies know that they were about to collapse? I suspect yes and no. We know from the text that the Egyptians are sending grain shipments up to the Hittites as what we would call today food relief assistance. So I think they did, some of them did know. I also don't think they could do anything about it. But it's also been said that there are always people that are usually doom and gloom, what we would call Cassandras, that nobody listens to. And then afterward they say, see, I told you so. Yeah. So I think the bureaucracies are one thing, but I think for me, a very interesting question is, did they know they were collapsing? And even if they did know, was there anything they could do about it? And that's where I think it's relevant to today. And quite a few of the questions that were asked by the people in the class were, what does this have to do with today? And that's where I really want everyone to read in the bureaucracy in the White House and everything. I'm like, I want them to say, ooh, look what happened in the Bronze Age. Look what's happening today. Should we be worried? Because my answer is yes. Yes, we should be worried. And I may be a Cassandra, but I'm
with you.
One of the things I've just done in the revised edition is I've come down more solidly on the side of, yes, climate change was bigger back then than we had thought, and that it's more of a driver. And I end the book more strongly on words of warning. I'm actually trying to become a Cassandra. In the original book, I was trying to be a typical historian, hands-off, objective, this. And now I've gotten so many comments on Amazon and elsewhere that I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to be that objective anymore. I'm going to take off my hat and say, here's what I see. You asked for my opinion. Here's what I see. I might be wrong. I probably am wrong. Most historians are wrong, but here's what I think. So
you can only hope you're wrong.
Yes, exactly. I hope I'm wrong, but this is what I see. So, yeah. So I do think that the collapse of the Bronze Age, as the collapse of many of the other societies that you're looking at, I do think there are lessons for us today, maybe not one-to-one, and it may not be that history repeats itself, but Mark Twain said history rhymes, and I think that's for sure. Yeah. So, yeah. So studying this stuff is not a waste of time. It's not just an academic exercise. There are things that can be applied to today, I think, and we can learn from ancient history, medieval history, even history from 100 years ago. Looking at the Spanish flu, for example, in 1918, has all kinds of lessons for us today, like don't hold big parades. Not a good idea, So anyway, yes. So
all right, let's go on to Leonid.
Yeah, I have the question also. So in the articles I read about the Bronze Age, I've seen the parallels between the contemporary world and the world of the Bronze Age. And I want to understand now how similar they are, these two worlds, in terms of, so to speak, interrelatedness and this globality, so to speak. And for example, did they have a common currency? How unified the culture was? What was the border policy, and so on?
Oh, excellent questions. So, and we have a disparity too that we need to take into account, but we've also got similarities. So on the one hand, I think that back then, by the end of the late Bronze Age, they are globalized to a certain extent. Now we're globalized today such that, what happens in Japan impacts the United States within 5 minutes. The stock markets go down, all of that. Now, certainly the late Bronze Age was not globalized like that, but within our area that we're talking about, and it's not such a little area, from Italy on the west to what is today Afghanistan on the east, and from like Turkey today down to Egypt, those areas were so interconnected that I would call them globalized for their time. They are interacting. They are, most importantly, dependent on one another. They're not self-sufficient. If you're living at Mycenae on mainland Greece and you want something made of gold, you're going to have to trade with Egypt because that's where the gold is coming from, right? Nubia, Sudan, the mines over there. But vice versa, if you want something that's made of silver and you're living in Egypt, you're going to have to trade with the Mycenaeans because the silver mines are at Lavrion outside of Athens. So all of your main primary raw materials, silver, gold, tin, copper, you all are dependent on everybody else. In fact, that's where I liked what Carol Bell said, a scholar in England. She said that tin for them back then, the need for tin is like our need for oil today. And that still resonates. So from that viewpoint, I think they were globalized and I think they were interconnected. And in some ways that was both good because that allowed them to rise up, but it also was bad because I think that contributed to the domino effect when one after another, they all came down. So, and that's going to be part of this systems collapse. But there again, I've got questions, and some of you were asking this. In the domino effect, in terms of collapse, which one collapsed first? And how did it impact them? And I don't know that answer. Again, we can't get that granular, we can't get that specific. Did Mycenae go down first and that affected the Hittites? Or did the trade routes to Afghanistan get cut and no more tin, and that's what happened? Or did the Hittites get invaded and so no more copper? No, I don't know the order in which these happened, but I do know that, something happened. So in terms of globalization, there have been a number of comments, and I know people tell authors and historians and all that, you're not supposed to read the comments that people leave under YouTube videos, for example, or under Amazon reviews. I have to admit, and I speak for most authors, we can't help ourselves. We read them, of course we do, and then we yell at the computer screen, or sometimes we write responses, which is not usually a good idea. And a lot of people have said in those reviews, look, you're comparing apples and oranges. Globalization today is very different from what you're calling globalization back then. And my response would be, yes, you're quite right. It's different, but I do think it's apples to apples, because what was relevant for them and what's relevant for us is at two different scales. But even so, the same sorts of things are happening. So I think it is relevant to call it that. And especially since the periods of globalization that we've had throughout human history are fairly rare. There aren't that many times when you've got that much interaction. And you can probably think of them just like I can. Period of the Roman Empire, for example, for sure, but not so much the others. Now, the other thing that people have complained about, they're like, well, where's India? Why aren't you mentioning the Harappan civilization? And I'm like, well, because they already collapsed back in about 1900 BC. They've been gone for 700 years. So like, no, they didn't collapse yet. I'm like, I don't know whose history you're reading, but in my history, they collapsed back in an earlier famine and drought at the end of the early Bronze Age. And they're like, well, you don't even talk about China. And I'm like, you're right, I don't. And they're like, why not? I'm like, because they're not in this international trade system. They're outside the system. They're not part of this. And as a result, they're not affected. And somebody else said, I see you've left out Australia. And I'm like, yeah, I left out Australia. And they're like, why? I'm like, because. Like, all right. So, so we're talking about this one area. So, yeah, the year civilization collapsed, it does it in this particular area, but I still think it's totally valid. So, anyway, I don't know if that answered most of what you were asking, but those are some of my thoughts on it.
Just to throw something out there, next week, Fred Hebert's going to give a talk about his work in the Eurasian steppes, and that'll relate to the collapse of the Harappan society.
Excellent. That will be wonderful. Fred's a great guy. I know him from graduate school, and honestly, just between us, and don't tell him this, but if I had to redo my archaeological career again, I would totally do what he's done with Central Asia. Absolutely fascinating. And there's so much to do there. I'm not quite sure I want to go excavate in Afghanistan right now, but one of my big questions, and maybe you can ask him this, is we know they're getting the tin from that area, and we've got the text at Mari and all that saying that, but who in Afghanistan at that time is actually doing the mining? Like, who is the civilization there? As far as I can tell, and I've read pretty much everything Fred's written, I think they're, we've got a name for them in terms of origin, but I don't think we know that much about them because not much archaeology has been done. I know that they stopped digging the tin there because I think the mines petered out, but is there a civilization in Afghanistan at that time that we should be talking about, like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans? Is there a 10th member to our group of the G8 or the G9? And by the way, the G9 is if you split Mycenaeans and Minoans and don't just call them the Aegean. So if it's just the Aegean, it's G8, Minoans, Mycenaean, G9. But so this is my question. I've never actually asked Fred, even though he's right here in DC at National Geographic. Who is the group there from whom they are getting the tin? And did they become incredibly wealthy? And they're mining lapis lazuli there also. So, inquiring minds need to know these things. But I don't know the answer. He might.
I will bring it up to him.
Good.
Alyssa.
Since we're talking about economy, I want to know if they had tariffs, and in what way did they protect their economy from foreign products?
Can you repeat the first part? Did they have what?
Tariffs.
Still didn't get it. Okay.
Tariffs? Like customs?
Tariffs. Like Trump keeps trying to put on every other country in the world?
Yeah, exactly.
I would say yes, but we don't have that much evidence for it. The closest we can come, and again, this is something for an economic historian and somebody like, if you could get Kevin McGew to come and chat with you, he's an expert on the text at Ugarit, knows them inside and out, or even Chris Monroe. And that's where I'm getting most of my information. I would say the closest we could come would be something like the Sinaranu text, where we've got this merchant in Ugarit in about, what would that be, about 1260 BC. And he's the man that says, or the king says, when the ship of Sinaranu, which has been sent to Crete, when it comes back with grain and beer and olive oil, he does not have to pay tax to the palace. So he's exempt. So I think that's a little bit different from a tariff because it's not being imposed on the other country, but it is a duty import tax, I would say, imposed on the merchants. So kind of, sort of. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, they're going to have import duties and tariffs to a certain extent. Whether they use them in trade wars, I don't have any evidence for that, but some of the economic historians might have. But I do think that the Sinaranu text, one person said it's the earliest corporate tax exemption in history, which I think is a nice way of putting it. So, yeah, personally, I think there are tariffs that the government would have imposed or the equivalent taxes on goods. I think that makes sense. I think almost every government throughout time has done such things. So that was the first half. Your second half, you remind me, what was your second part?
Just how they imposed it, but
right. So yeah, so I think they imposed it pretty much the way that we impose it today. Guards at the port saying, okay, you can't bring your boxes of goods in yet until you've either paid us or bribed us, and that always happened also.
Thank you.
Sonia?
Yes, as I understood from the presentation of your book on YouTube, in case of the Bronze Age civilization, earthquakes were not taken into account as the reason of the collapse of this civilization. And my question is, how do you think which factors of collapse or rise of civilization are also underestimated?
Excellent question, and impossible to answer, because how do we know what we don't know, right? How do we know what's not there? So yes, people underestimated earthquakes, I think, though some people still say, oh, it's not as much as you think. So I would say the best way to examine that would be to perhaps to look at other collapses like you're studying and look at the factors that affected other collapses and then say, could they have been back in the Bronze Age and we're not considering them yet? So for instance, in the first iteration of my book, I didn't consider collapse. It just never came up because nobody had suggested it. And there's no real evidence for it. So I didn't even take it into account. It was only after the book came out and people started saying to me, well, what about disease? And I kind of was flippant at first. I'm like, yeah, there's no disease. And they're like, but how do you know? And then I'm like, because. And then they're like, no, how do you know? And I'm like, okay, all right, let me think about this seriously. And then I'm like, yeah, you're right. It could have been a possibility. So where do we go to look for the evidence? And so I still don't find evidence for it, but in the new part of the book that I've added in, I say, here's what we should look for. And so if you're going to say, well, maybe disease was back then, I think you need to look for mass graves, for example. You might need to look at inscriptions, at texts that talk about death and pandemic. The problem is, first of all, if everybody is dying of disease, usually people don't stop to write it down, except they do. We know, for example, the Great Plague in Athens. We know that the historian Thucydides not only wrote it down, but that he had it and he survived it. And he wrote down and said, if you've got these symptoms, you probably got the plague, right? Same thing with the plagues that hit the Roman Empire, Justinian plague and the Cyprian plague and all. They're writing about it. And of course, in the Middle Ages, they're writing about it too. So you would expect if disease is back then that somebody would have written about it. And I don't see that yet. But the other question that I've got, which I'm going to suggest, is we do have skeletons from back then. We don't have a lot, but we do have, some bodies from Megiddo and from elsewhere. We now know that we can do DNA analysis on them. And they're mostly focusing on, genetic identity and this and that. But in some diseases like malaria, it will affect the bones. And in fact, it can get, if it gets into the blood, it can be in the teeth. It gets into the enamel and the pulp, I believe. So, maybe you guys know more about that than I do. I'm wondering now if the DNA geneticist can look at the ancient skeletons and the ancient DNA and tell us, yes, this person was suffering from typhoid or cholera or malaria. But since it's not my specialty, I don't know how long somebody would have had to suffer from it before it would have left an impact in the DNA. So I would say, in terms of your question, in terms of what are we underestimating or missing completely, I don't know, because I don't know what I don't know. So, but disease was definitely in there. And I suspect it may be other things as well. So that's where I might say, too, take your studies of other civilizations and other collapses, see what impacted them, and then say, could that have been a factor back in the Bronze Age, too, that we haven't talked about? I think that would be a very interesting set of observations. So it's a great question. Very good question.
Anna?
So yeah, hello, Eric. My question is based on your lectures, which Jay sent us. So if we are facing a similar situation as LBA civilization did, collapsed. So why today's civilizations have not collapsed yet? So is it due that our civilizations do not have the same strong dependence on each other as LBA civilization did? or is it some another like explanation for it?
All right, another excellent question. Excellent question. And I would say, hold on. Why haven't we collapsed yet? I'm not so sure we're not in the middle of a collapse right now. I think future historians are going to look back at 2020, and somebody's going to write a book, and I've already got the title for it. It's going to be called 2020 Hindsight. And they're going to be looking back. As I think it's a great title. I know, I love it, but somebody else has to write the book because it's going to happen in 100 years. I would actually kind of throw it back to you and say, why don't you think we're collapsing yet? I think, look, we've got climate change, we've got droughts, we've got famine, we've got immigrants, right? People fleeing the Syrian war, people fleeing from North Africa going up to Europe. We've got, I would actually say we've got everything that they had at the late Bronze Age. And so we might be resilient enough that we will survive this. And I do think that we have the technology, right? They used to say in the $6 Million Man, we've got the technology, we can do this. So we may well be able to survive it, whereas the Hittites wouldn't have known what to do. So, if you want to be optimistic, we might be able to do that. But on the other hand, I might be pessimistic and say, your question is too early, because I don't know that we haven't survived. It's like, come back and ask me in 50 years, and then I'll say, yeah, we did great. But one of the things that I just put in this new edition is I said, where are we? Are we in a collapse? And to go back to an earlier question, what's going to be the one that pushes us over the edge? Or is this COVID-19 pandemic, is this it? Have we just been pushed over the edge? Because I think you also have to consider all the indirect stuff and the ripple effects. Speaking solely for myself, sitting here in Washington, D.C., the pandemic, I've been in my house since March 12th. I've gone out 4 times. Which, is unheard of because I'm usually out every day. But look at the unemployment. We've got, 36 million out of work now. We've got the economy is tanking. These, I think, are the things that are going to push us down. The pandemic, yes, 100,000 dead in the United States is horrible. That's not going to collapse us. But the unemployment and everything else combined, that's what's going to take us down. So we're definitely in a new normal. I think what we're going to see, and I'm going to put this into the next book, into the sequel, we are going to get into a period of transformation, and we're going to see just how resilient we are in Europe, in Russia, in the United States, in Australia. And I think life as we know it is going to be substantially changed quite soon. Next couple of months, next couple of years, I think it'll be very different. So this is why this is an excellent question, maybe premature, because I don't think we've survived it yet. They're saying over here that the worst is yet to come, to which my reaction is, uh-oh. Uh-oh, I thought it was pretty bad already. So we shall see. And I don't know how many more months I can stay in my house without going stir crazy. So I may just have to jump in the car and just go for a drive with no destination. I can just come back, but we'll see. Anyway, but thank you for that. I do have a quick question for all of you, if I can jump in. Some of you have gotten hold of the Russian translation of 1177, I understand. And I just wanted to ask, is the translation any good? Because my knowledge of Russian is limited to Das Vidanya and I think Zakuski, which, I don't know much more than that. So is the Russian translation any good? Is it accurate? Anyway, that's just a question if anybody happens to have seen it. You don't have to answer, but I'm curious.
Good.
Yeah, I was next to ask a question, and it was based on your book. So I will answer your question. I have no time. I haven't time to read it all, but I looked through it, and I think that the translation is solid. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Good to know.
My question is, I'm interested in connecting history and our real times. And so I'm interested in how rebellions were functioning in terms of, for instance, punishment from governments, or governments and states were trying to do the situation better by, for instance, talking with people and bringing to them what they need, like different reforms and so on. Is it similar to what is happening now when police fights with people, beats them, and so on?
Okay. Yeah, so almost how much did the government interfere back then? How much was it almost, shall we say, a police state, that kind of thing? How much did they help people?
Yeah, like connected to rebellions.
Connected to specifically to rebellions.
Because I looked through, through your book, and there are a lot of chapters which discuss rebellions.
Right, exactly. Yes. Yeah, so very good question. So now you have to remember, though, when we talk about internal rebellion, which is what you'd be referring to, it's mostly hypothetical. We think it might have happened. So, for instance, the two that come to my mind are Mycenae and Hatzor. So Mycenae in Greece, we know that the city is destroyed to a certain extent. It's definitely humans. Things are burnt and all that. Yes, there's earthquake too, but it looks like it's humans. And same thing at Hatzor in what is now modern day Israel. But at neither place do we have any evidence of external invaders coming in and setting fire to it. So then the question becomes, if it's not external, is it internal? And so at Hatzor, for example, my favorite example is the two co-directors, where Amnon Ben Tor thought it was invaders, Israelites or Egyptians or whatever. And Sharon Zuckerman said, no, look, the palace is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, but the houses of the common people and their shops, they're not destroyed. So it's the rebellion by the lower classes. So, and I think she's maybe right, but this is why I say it's hypothetical. We don't have any proof that that's actually what happened. As a result, we don't have any proof one way or the other as to what the government did about it, right? Did they crack down on it? Did they kill everybody? We just don't know. What we need, to be honest, and as an archaeologist, I keep coming back to this, we need to find an archive. We need to find more texts, right? History, for me, is archaeology plus text. That's what I always tell my students. We dig it up and we find the material culture, but then we find the text to tell us what happened. And of course, bear in mind, and this is what somebody else asked, how much can we trust what they're writing about, right? Or are they exaggerating? Can you take it at face value? I want a text at either Hatzor or Mycenae that says, there was a rebellion by the lower class. I have put it down. I killed all of them. That's what I want. Much like, who was it? The slave revolt, Spartacus with the Romans, and they tell us about that. So the answer, I'm afraid, to your question is, I don't know the answer. I don't know how the governments responded, if at all, because it's a house of cards. It's one thing built on another. If we're right that there was a rebellion, then yes, the government should have responded. How did they respond? I don't know. Now, there is one thing that is not quite what you're asking, but there are new texts that have just been published, and by just, I mean since 2016, from Ugarit. And in those texts, there are more that are letters. For example, there's one from a private individual to the king, and it says, we don't have any food. Nobody in the city has food. So it's evidence that Ugarit had famine too, which we didn't have before. But it's also evidence of a private citizen asking the king for help. Now, what the king did, we don't know. But we have another letter from the king of Egypt, which says, and it's kind of fun because he's quoting the word back. He says to the king of Ugarit, you wrote to me and you said, we are starving here in Ugarit. So here, I am sending you this. And then he lists everything he sends. And it's basically a relief mission. And my favorite is he sends 7,000 dried fish, which I don't know if you want to eat 7,000 dried fish, but all right, whatever, it's food. And he also says, I'm sending beads and textiles. And my reaction is, well, that's pretty, but you can't eat beads and textiles. So anyway, so that's evidence of how the governments are helping each other. And we know, for example, that Egypt and the Hittites, who had been enemies just back, the Battle of Kadesh in 1274, within 50 years, they've not only signed a peace treaty, but the Egyptians are sending food up to the Hittites with relief missions. So your question about how much the governments interfered, it's hard to say without more written evidence, but the evidence that we are suggesting is more that they're being helpful rather than that they're cracking down. But it will be fascinating if one day we find a text that said, the lower people rebelled and I killed them all. Then we'll have our answer. Yeah. So, but very good question.
Yeah, I mean, just as an archaeologist who happens to work in an area where you do have written records, there's probably nothing more satisfying to have archaeological record correlating strongly with written record.
Exactly. And I'm very jealous of people like you who are able to have both. Right? Yes.
Daria.
Yes, I also has a question about a comparison those times and our present time. So recently I watched TED Talk about a project of the new Silk Road that should, connect all the world with high-speed railways. And so my question is, the project will be like a new stage of globalization, and what difficulties can face the system in comparison with the, for example, ancient trade routes or the Silk Road? And I mean, in those times, there was some trade ways that connect this big civilization, and how can it work in comparison of our present time?
Very good question. So I actually think they're very, very similar. You've got the ancient Silk Road that Peter Frankopan and others have studied. And then, as you say, there's this idea for a new Silk Road with this, what is it called? The ultra high speed fast train. I think that it's going to be both good and bad, and very similar to antiquity, in that it's basically going to be a new international trade route or connector. And the good part, of course, is that as long as it works, you're going to get much more interconnection, much more globalization, if you want, much easier to transport the goods back and forth. Everybody's going to be more connected. The bad side, the downside, is going to be if we come to depend upon that, and if it's cut for whatever reason, whether something happens on one end or the other, or whether somebody blows up part of the tracks in the middle of it, or whatever, somebody interrupts it, and we've become dependent upon it. If we're too dependent on it, then that's really going to shake us to the core. So I would argue, I would tell the planners that they need to instill a degree of caution and a couple of backup systems. Right. In addition to plan A, you always want a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. So good, put the high-speed rail in as plan A, that's great, but also have something ready to go as plan B and plan C in case it gets disrupted to any degree, because if you're too dependent upon it, then you're going to be in a catastrophic situation. So, I think it's a great idea. I would also make sure that they realize that if something happens and we're too dependent, then they need to go to something else. So, and that's where I think a parallel to back at the end of the Bronze Age is probably a very good one. I think their international trade routes did get cut, and they were not expecting that. And they did not have anything in place to do a workaround. And what they eventually do is figure out how to make iron properly, easily, cheaply, and fast. And so the iron takes place of the bronze. But that's going to take 100 years or more. So I would like us to have that workaround in place already. And then I'd feel a lot more confident about it. But it's a great idea. But let's see how it works in actuality.
Artyom, we get you again?
Yeah, it's me again. And well, Eric, you've talked about this biblical archaeology and that you consider yourself biblical archaeologist, and that the focus is not on proven and disproven, but on the way that people lived in some sense. But for me, it kind of looks as an empty spot about like religious context of this time, because, well, we know there is today there is Christianity as the world religion, there is Islam as the world religion, there's Buddhism as the world religion, but Christianity and Islam haven't existed at that time, and Buddhism was just somewhere in India. So what do we know about the religious beliefs and customs of people of like Bronze Age?
Right. Good question. And the short answer is we know a lot. We know a lot because of their texts. So, but this is where you get into some of the problems with ancient history and archaeology, that we all have our subspecialties. So if you want to study something like the religion of the Bronze Age, you're going to have to be able to read either in the original or in a translation the text of the Hittites, which talk a lot about Hittite religion and ritual. You're going to be able to read Egyptian, because we know a lot about the religion and the ritual there, and Ugaritic. The text at Ugarit talk a lot about Canaanite religion and Canaanite ritual. So we know the pantheons, we know the names of the gods and the goddesses for the Hittites, for the Egyptians, for the Canaanites. They're each different, right? They each have their own religions. So if you're interested in that topic, that's a whole field that's wide open with lots of information. And you're going to come out with all sorts of interesting different ideas and opinions. What is interesting for us today, though, is most of that goes down with the collapse of the late Bronze Age. Like the Hittite gods and goddesses, you've got Neo-Hittites and all that. But Judaism survives, right? This is where you've got Moses, and you've got the question of when did monotheism actually begin, right? Is Abraham practicing monotheism, or is it polytheism, right? And of course, Abraham is worshiping a god sometimes referred to as El, and you've got others where they talk about the god Baal. Baal is a Canaanite god, and yet, and even in the Ten Commandments, it says, "You shall have no other god before me," which implies there's other gods. He's just supposed to be the top one. So we have a lot of information about that, and it's a fascinating set of fields. There are translations from the original languages. So, you know, if your Hittite isn't quite up to speed these days, or you have to brush up on your Akkadian, you can get translations into most languages. So, you know, you can do a lot. So if that's a field that you're interested in, there is a lot that you can read about. So, and that actually impacts my interest too. I've often wondered if their belief in whatever gods and goddesses and whatever rituals, did that impact their response to the collapse? So we know, for example, when again, my favorite guy, Shupilululiuma, the king of the Hittites, when he dies of the plague in 1350, one of his successors, Mershili, he leaves what's called the plague prayers. And in the plague prayers, he's praying to the gods and the goddesses, and he's blaming something that Shupilululiuma did wrong, and the gods were angry and sent the plague. So, from a religious aspect, if that's part of, the collapse, then the response, religiously speaking, is very interesting.
It sounds like the Trump-Obama relationship, right? It was Obama's fault.
Yeah, it's all about it. Exactly. According to Trump. Exactly. It's Shupilululiuma's fault.
Exactly.
Yes. In fact, maybe we should now start a new trend on Twitter, hashtag Shupilululiumagate.
That's right. Sonia, you got a hand up again?
Yeah. My next question is also connected with you already said. And do you think that speculating about alternative history can also help us learn some lessons? Can we ask such kind of question to come to some conclusion about what might have happened, or are the development of civilization so unpredictable that alternative history will never go beyond simple speculation?
Great question. And I have to say, alternative history, or contrapositive, as they sometimes call it, I think is fascinating. It's so much fun. It's the what if, right? What if Alexander the Great had not died? Would he have conquered Rome? Would we not have had the Romans? So, yes. So your question, if I understand it, would be something like, what if the late Bronze Age had not collapsed? What if they had been able to do, or at any other period in history? So is it useful? Can it go beyond speculation? This is what you're asking, right? So can it go beyond speculation? Probably not. I think it'll just remain speculation. Is it useful? Absolutely. Because it helps us think about the alternatives and what might they have done if they had done this, and what might they have done if they had done this. And for me, that in terms of today goes into speculation about what we might be able to do. And in fact, I put something into the revised book because one of my colleagues up in Canada, he said this is where computer modeling would come in, right? If you could do a computer modeling of these alternative histories, if you had done this, would it have worked? What if you had tried this? What if you had done this? And so he wants what he calls agent-based modeling to be done to actually put this to the test. So, and that's where your whole, is it more speculation? And can you go beyond that? If you could put it to a computer application, then you might. Now, I might have to eat my words. Maybe you can go further than that. And so in the book, I actually just put in a little joke. I'm like, I don't think they had computer-based modeling back in the Bronze Age, so it wouldn't have helped them. But we do today. So, but I looked into it, and that's very, frankly, it's beyond me. All right, somebody that knows computers needs to do this. Agent-based modeling, computer simulations, all of this. I think that would be very worthwhile, but that's huge numbers crunching and all that. I think it could be done for the Bronze Age, and I actually wanted him to do that, but it would be such a big project. But if you're interested in things like alternative history and all that, that might be the way to go, is to figure out how to make a computer model for back then and crunch it and see, is there anything they could have done to reverse the collapse? And I'd be fascinated to know what the answer would be and whether they could have done it. So, and just as a last answer to your question, if I were better at writing fiction, which I tried it once, I wrote a novel once, and I sent it to an agent, and he wrote back to me, he said, stick to archaeology and nonfiction. Yeah, you can't write dialogue. I'm like, yeah, okay, fine. But if I were any good at that, I would love to write an alternative history about the end of the Bronze Age. Right? And I've actually got a friend who does write alternative history. He's got one about the Romans coming to North America and fighting, and very, very well done. So I think it's really neat to think about what if. And I do think it's useful, but it's also in the realm of over here. I think we need to separate it from actual historical questions. But I also think, and here, this will be my last comment here to this question, I think this is where computer games come in. I would love to see a game in which you're doing a first-person role model, whatever they're called, in which you can be a Hittite, you can be an Egyptian, you can be a Canaanite. And, it's like the Civilizations games, that would work. And I think it'd be really fun to figure out what might have happened. I do know there's a game coming out like any day now in the Total War series, and it's called Total War Troy, but it's not out yet. And me, since the Trojan War is one of my favorite periods, I would love to be able to go in and play as Achilles or Hector or whatever. But also knowing me, I would probably try and bring the Trojan War to a nice peaceful conclusion. But
destroy history.
Anyway, so if anybody out there is into creating computer games, yeah, I think there's a wide open, lots of money to be made on creating a game based on the collapse of the late Bronze Age.
I think we're out of questions, which is good because we're just down to a few minutes left. Anyways, I will say on that a couple of things. First of all, my ex-wife is a well-published science fiction and fantasy writer, and one of her steampunk books is based on a turning point in history happening that Carthage wins the Punic Wars. And there's much greater African influence in Europe, and so it changes the course of history. The book takes place in the Industrial Revolution period, but history had changed at that point.
Yeah, neat. Yeah, so it all goes back to if somebody steps on a butterfly way back when.
Exactly.
And then the dinosaurs never go away. Right. Yeah, that's neat stuff. Okay, well, I may have to read some of that.
Yeah, I'll send you a link. Also, there is a game series out called Assassin's Creed.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I know that they have like a tourist model where like you play somebody walking through Egypt, and I think there's one in Greece and one in Egypt. I'm not
yes,
sure.
and in fact, my main complaint, so Assassin's Creed Odyssey is supposed to be excellent as the one in Egypt. They don't make them for Mac. So in order to play it on a PC, I have to hijack my son's computer, which he protests about. But yes, I know actually people that are using those games to teach.
Yeah, I was going to try it on the Egypt one.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that they use a lot of archaeologists, and so the archaeology, the architecture is very accurate.
Yes.
And a lot of the cultural scenes. There's a lot of domestic scenes and people working in fields and things like that. And I know they just released it for free too, so you can access it for free now.
Okay, well, I'll have to go hijack his computer. So
I'll send you a link on that also.
Yes, very good, very good. But I actually think also, as an ancient historian, that this is a great way to teach other people about ancient history, because if they're accurate, then they have a little bit more of an idea of what life might have been like back then. Yeah. Of course, it's all speculation, but to put yourself into somebody's shoes back then may bring it to life, especially if the generation doing it is more used to being online and more used to playing games. It's a great way to teach without teaching, shall we say.
Yeah, no, I'm convinced that the future of teaching is going to include a lot more virtual reality engagement.
Yeah. I absolutely agree.
Where you're talking about Rome while sitting virtually in Rome talking about it, or in Luxor or Jerusalem.
Yeah. And actually, classes like this, I think, are going to become much more the norm. At GW in March, we went totally online because they wouldn't let us back on campus. Yeah. And they're finding out that it works. In fact, just like today, I'm getting, with my students, I got more one-on-one interaction because in the classroom was somebody sitting in the back. I couldn't call on them. And here I'm like, hey, like, Sonia, you haven't said anything. Why aren't you talking? And then I'm like, okay, you got to talk. So I actually think that this medium is going to be much more common, and it's going to turn out to be very, very, very effective.
Yeah, I know. I really like
virtual reality.
Well,
if through Rome, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
No, we are. Yeah, the technology's here now. It's just a matter of us implementing it.
Yeah, and it's mostly, in my case, a case of whether us old dinosaurs can make the transition. How resilient can we be? But you know, so far so good, and we keep getting little bits. I mean, you can't really see it, but here the other day we bought a ring light. So you know, to get the lighting better, and I bought a microphone because I'm thinking if I'm going to do this. But the next thing, I need to get a green screen to attach to the back of my chair so I could be at Mycenae while talking to you. Because if we're going to be teaching online next year, we got to do it.
Yeah, I think there was just a new update for Zoom that might minimize that. I just saw a note on that, so I don't know how effective it is.
Right. So that would be would be neat. But yeah, I think we're looking at the future. I think this is part of the transition that we're going to be going through. And especially higher education in all the countries. I think this is going to really impact. We'll see how many of the smaller colleges and universities that used to meet face-to-face actually survive this, how many incorporate each other and consolidate, and how many go to online. It's going to be a very interesting period. But so far, I'm finding that this is extremely effective. And look, I get to talk to all of you, which in the normal course of things, I wouldn't be able to do. And, you know,
Russia,
yeah, exactly. May I say, from my point of view, thank you for inviting me, and thank all of you for your great questions. This has been, the only word I can say is this has been fun. It's been fun. And thank you for your questions and for allowing me into your homes and to answer these questions. So, you know, if we can ever do this again, I am at your beck and call. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You know, I want to say one last thing, and that was a question that was put to you about the future and about how we see where we are in collapse. What I'd like to tell my students is that they're the future and they're going to decide about that collapse. And that's what they're here learning, is to be equipped and armed to be able to determine that future. Exactly. All we can do, we've already screwed up, and we messed up our part, so we just pass it on to them now.
Yeah. That's actually how I end most of my 1177 lectures these days. I say, look, I look backward. I'm an ancient historian. You are the future. So I've just pointed things out to you. Now it's up to you to fix it, and please do so. So, so yes, you are the next generation. Please go solve what we screwed up. Yes.
Exactly.
Anyway, yes.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. This has been fantastic. It's been great to see you again. I was hoping I'd see you in Hawaii at some point there, but that didn't work out. So
right. Well, next year we've tentatively scheduled it for, I think, sometime in February. So I may yet see you in Hawaii. And,
okay, or maybe if we actually have a conference in person again sometime, AIAs or something.
Exactly.
I first met you, you probably don't remember, I think it was 1990 at an AIA in San Francisco. You were a grad student at the time, as I recall.
Oh, my word, was it that early?
Yeah.
I had been thinking it was much later. I had been thinking it was the World Archaeological Conference.
That's where we were in the same session together.
Exactly. That's where I remember you from, 1990. Oh, word. Oh, I was still in diapers at that point.
Yeah, I was a cop, actually. I was an undergraduate, but I was working as a cop in San Jose. So.
Oh, how interesting. Wow. Wow. Listen, everybody, the worlds we travel. Yes. Yeah. Good. Well, nice.
Well, thank you again. I'll stay on for a while if anyone has any questions, anything they want to talk about. And Eric, you're welcome to stay if you want.
But I will take my leave of you all. But be good. And is this where I can say Das Vidanya?
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.